Let's now look at illustration number 36. Lessee enters into a 10-year lease for 5,000 square meters of office space. At the beginning of year 6, the lessee and the lessor agree to amend the original lease for the remaining 5 years to reduce the lease payments from 1 lakh rupees to 95,000 per annum. Now, when we entered into a 10-year lease, the amount that we agreed to pay to the lessor was rupees 1 lakh per annum. 5 years have passed by, all right? 5 years have passed by, and at the beginning of year 6, we have renegotiated the contract wherein the lessee is agreeing to pay to the lessor only 95,000 per annum. The interest rate implicit in lease cannot be readily determined. The lessee's incremental borrowing rate as at the date of commencement was 6%. When we originally commenced the contract, when the lease originally commenced, the incremental borrowing rate was 6%, and the lessee's incremental borrowing rate at the beginning of year 6 is 7% per annum. All right, so at the beginning of year 6, it is 7% per annum. The annual lease payments are payable at the end of each year. The question is, how is the modification actually accounted for? All right, remember, this is a case of a modification where there is only a change in the consideration that we are paying. All right, there's a change in the consideration that we are paying, and there is no change in the scope of lease. All right, there's no change in the scope of lease, and there's only a change in the amount of consideration that is actually being paid. All right, let's start solving the question now. Now we are going to start by calculating the lease liability on the date of commencement. All right, let's start by calculating the lease liability at the date of commencement of lease. All right, now on the date of commencement, we know that the amount of lease payments that are required to be made is rupees 1 lakh per annum. The amount of lease payments required to be made is rupees 1 lakh per annum, and the term of the lease was 10 years. All right, so the lease liability would have been calculated as I would have years 1 to 10. I have cash flow of rupees 1 lakh. All right, remember, this is like an annuity cash flow. Every year, if I'm supposed to make a payment of 1 lakh, I'm actually considering it like an annuity cash flow. And then I have the present value factor. The present value factor needs to be calculated at 6% because as at the commencement of lease, the lessee's incremental borrowing rate was 6%. All right, so this is going to be present value factor at 6%, and I then have the discounted cash flow. All right, so if I calculate the present value annuity factor at 6% for 10 years, that number is going to be equal to 7.3601. It's 7.3601. All right, so the discounted cash flow is going to be 1 lakh multiplied by 7.3601, which is equal to 7,36,010 rupees. All right, so the lease liability as on the date of commencement would have been 7,36,010 rupees. If we think of the journal entry would be ROU asset debit of 7,36,010 and credit lease liability to lease liability 7,36,010 rupees. All right, so it's going to be ROU asset debit of 7,36,000 and lease liability credit of 7,36,010 again. All right, this ROU asset would be depreciated over a period of 10 years. The lease term is 10 years, so ROU asset would be depreciated over a period of 10 years. The depreciation per annum on this ROU asset would be 7,36,010 rupees divided by 10 years because the lease term is 10 years. So that is going to be equal to rupees 73,601. Since the lease term is 10 years, this ROU asset will be depreciated over a period of 10 years. Now, the question mentioned that at the beginning of year 6, we are actually going to change the terms and conditions of the contract wherein the consideration is actually going to change. So, I would like to find out what is the carrying amount of the ROU asset at the beginning of year 6. I would like to find out what is the carrying amount of the ROU asset at the beginning of year 6. Beginning of year 6 is the same as end of year 5. So, I would like to know what is the carrying amount of the ROU asset at the end of year 5. If I have to calculate the carrying amount at the end of year 5, it is going to be the original amount at which I recognize the ROU asset, which is 7,36,010, less I would have charged depreciation for a period of 5 years. So it will be 73,601 multiplied by 5. All right, I originally recognized the ROU asset at 7,36,010. I charged the depreciation of 73,601 for a period of 5 years. So the carrying amount is going to be equal to 3,68,500. 5 rupees. All right. So the carrying amount of ROU asset, this is the carrying amount of ROU asset at the end of year 5 is going to be 3,68,005 rupees. Now, similarly, I would also like to find out what is going to be the carrying amount of the liability at the end of fifth year. All right. So just like how I calculated the carrying amount of the ROU asset at the end of fifth year, I also would like to know what is the carrying amount of the liability of the lease liability at the end of fifth year, for which I have to actually prepare a lease liability schedule. I have to now prepare a lease liability schedule, but I won't prepare a schedule for a period of 10 years because I'm only concerned with the lease liability at the end of fifth year. All right. So am actually going to restrict myself to preparing the lease liability schedule at the end of fifth year. All right. So let's start with the lease liability schedule. We have years, we have opening balance. The question mentioned that the payments are actually done in arrears. The payments are actually done at the end of each year. Therefore, we first have interest, we'll have interest, and then we are going to have payments. And finally, we will have closing liability. All right, we'll have closing balance or closing liability. Now, starting with year one, the opening balance for year one is basically the amount at which the liability would have been recognized. I recognize the liability at 7,36,010 rupees. All right, so the beginning balance for year one is 7,36,010. The beginning balance for year one is nothing but the amount that you recognize today at year zero. Whatever amount at which you're recognizing the liability, that will become the beginning balance for year one. We are then going to calculate interest at the rate of 6 percentage. All right, we will continue to calculate interest at the rate of 6 percentage, which is the interest at which we actually calculated the present value. All right, we calculated the present value using 6 percentage, and we are actually going to use the same 6 percentage for the purpose of calculating interest. So it is going to be 44,160.6. All right, it's 7,36,010 multiplied by 6 percentage. It is 7,36,010 multiplied by 6 percentage. I then have payments. Payments was equal to 1 lakh rupees. I'm making a payment of 1 lakh at the end of first year. So my closing balance becomes 736,010 plus 44,160.6 less 1 lakhs, which is equal to 6,80,170.6. This becomes my beginning balance for year 2. Whatever is the ending balance for year 1, that becomes the beginning balance for year 2. So it's 6,80,170.6. The interest for second year will be 6,80,170.6 multiplied by 6 percentage. So that is going to be equal to 40,810. All right, it's 40,810.2. I then have payments of equal to 1 lakh rupees. So I'm deducting this 1 lakh. The lease liability will be deducted by payments or will be reduced by payments. So my closing balance will be 6,80,170.6 plus 40,810.2 less 1 lakh, which is equal to 6,20,980.8. We then have this as the beginning balance for year 3. The ending balance for year 2 becomes the beginning balance for year 3, which is 6,20,980.8. I then have interest, which is going to be calculated at 6 percentage on the 6,20,000. So interest is going to be equal to 37,258.8. And then I have a payment of rupees 1 lakh again for the third year, and my closing balance will be 6,20,980.8 plus 37,258.8 less 1 lakhs, which is equal to 5,58,239.6. All right, so I have got 6,20,000 as the beginning liability. On that, I calculated interest at 6 percentage, and then I deduct the lease liability payment of 1 lakh, and I have a closing balance at the end of year 3 of 5,58,239.6. Now for year 4, this becomes the beginning balance. So I've got 5,58,239.6. On this, 6 percentage is going to be equal to 33,494, 33,494.4. I then have a payment of 1 lakh for year 4 as well, and my closing balance would become 5,58,239.6 plus 33,494.4 less 1 lakh, which is equal to 4,91,734. It's 4,91,734. Now for year 5 as well, the beginning balance is 4,91,734. On this, I calculate 6% interest, which is going to be equal to 29,504. And then I reduce a payment of 1 lakh, and my closing balance at the end of year 5, my closing balance at the end of year 5 is 4,91,734 plus 29,504 less 1 lakh, which is equal to 4,21,238. All right. So my closing balance at the end of year 5 is 4,21,238. The closing balance at the end of year 5 is also the beginning balance for year 6. Beginning of year 6 is when I'm actually changing the consideration. When me and the other party are renegotiating the consideration, the beginning balance at the end of at the beginning balance at year 6 is the same as ending balance for year 5, which is 4,21,238. All right, so I had an ROU asset in my books of 3,68,005, 3,68,005 at the end of year 5, and at the end of year 5 the lease liability was 4,21,238. Now, this is when the renegotiation in this contract is taking place, wherein the payment is reducing from 1 lakh to 95,000. The payment is reducing from 1 lakh to 95,000. This is a case where modification is not changing the scope of lease. All right. The same 5,000 square meters was available for lease before as well and after the modification as well. So there is no change in the scope of lease. Also, the lease term is the same. We are not changing the lease term. The only thing that's actually changing is the consideration. And what the standard requires us to do in this case is calculate the present value of the remaining lease payments. Now, the present value of the remaining lease payments is going to be the present value of the 95,000 that I am going to pay for the next 5 years. I'm standing at the beginning of year 6. So remaining lease term is 5 years. So the present value of 95,000 that is going to be paid for the remaining 5 years, discounted using today's incremental borrowing rate. Today's incremental borrowing rate is 7% per annum. All right. So what are we going to do? We are going to calculate the present value of 95,000 for the next 5 years, discounted at 7%. We will actually arrive at a lease liability. We are going to compare that with the lease liability in the books of accounts. All right. The books of accounts have got a lease liability of 4,21,238. What we are going to do is we are going to see the differential between what we have now calculated as the revised lease liability. The revised lease liability is present value of 95,000 at 7%. Compare that with the book value of the lease liability. The differential will basically be adjusted as a lease liability, and corresponding adjustment will be given to the right of use asset. All right. If you've not really understood, it's fine. Let's actually look at it using numbers. All right. So let's calculate revised lease liability at beginning of year 6. We are calculating the revised lease liability at beginning of year 6. All right. Now, at the beginning of year 6, there are 5 lease payments that are pending. At the beginning of year 6, there are 5 lease payments that are pending. We have payments that will be made of 95,000 at the end of year 6, end of year 7, end of year 8, end of year 9, and end of year 10. All right. So the years, I'm actually plotting them again as 1 to 5 because end of year 6 is 1 year away from where we are today. End of year 7 is 2 years away from where we are today. Today is basically beginning of year 6. End of year 6 is basically 1 year away from where we are today. To end of year 7 is 1 year, 2 years away from where we are standing today. Same way, 10th year payment is 5 years from where we are standing today. Therefore, the years I'm plotting is 1 to 5. We now have a cash flow of 95,000 per annum. The present value factor is also going to be calculated using the revised discount rate, which is 7%. This is the incremental borrowing rate today, and we are going to calculate the present value factor using 7%. That is going to be equal to 4.1001. All right. So the present value factor is going to be equal to 4.1002 in fact. All right. And we have the discounted cash flow as 95,000 multiplied by 4.1002, which is going to be equal to 3,89,519. All right. So the discounted cash flow is 3,89,519. And this is the amount of revised lease liability. After the change in consideration, the lease liability that should exist in your books is 3,89,519. All right. Before the modification took place, the lease liability in the books was 4,21,838. After the modification, the lease liability that should be recognized in your books of accounts is 3,89,519. Therefore, there is a reversal of lease liability that is required. Alright, your lease liability, which was earlier standing at 4,20,000, should now be reduced to 3,89,000. Therefore, in your books of accounts, there should be a reversal of lease liability. Reversal of lease liability is going to be 4,21,238 less 3,89,519. All right, reversal of lease liability is going to be equal to reversal of lease liability will be 4,21,000. What was it? 4,21,238 less 3,89,519. All right, 4,21,000 is the amount at which lease liability is recognized in the books of accounts. But because of the change in contract, because of the modification, the lease liability that should exist is 3,89,000, which means there should be a reversal of lease liability in the books of accounts to the tune of 421,238 less 389,519, which is equal to 31,719. All right, so the reversal of lease liability should be 31,719. All right, if lease liability should be reversed, lease liability being a liability in nature, it will have a credit balance. Reversal basically means that we got to debit lease liability. All right, lease liability will naturally have a credit balance, and because we want to reverse it, we are going to debit lease liability by 31,719, and we will be crediting right of use asset. We will be correspondingly crediting the right of use asset by 31,719. All right. So as a result of modification, lease liability and ROU asset, both of them are going to reduce by 31,719 rupees. All right. Because as part of the modification, the consideration that we are paying has reduced from 1 lakh to 95,000. There is a reduction in lease liability of 31,719. All right. As a result of reduction in lease liability, we are correspondingly also reducing the right of use asset. All right. Remember, the right of use asset had a carrying amount of 3,68,005. It had 3,68,005 rupees of carrying amount, of which we are now reducing the right of use asset by 31,000. We are reducing the carrying amount of right of use asset by 31,000. Therefore, the carrying amount of right of use asset, the carrying amount of right of use asset after modification is going to be equal to 3,68,005 rupees less 31,719, and that is going to be equal to rupees 3,36,286. It's 3,36,286. All right. So the carrying amount of the right of use asset after modification is 3,36,286, and the carrying amount of the lease liability after modification will be 3,89,519. You had a lease liability of 421. You reverse 31,000, and you have a lease liability amount of 3,89,519 in your books, and the carrying amount of the right of use asset will be 3,36,286 after the modification. This 336,286 will continue to be depreciated over a period of 5 years. Because the remaining lease term is 5 years, this will be depreciated over a period of 5 years, and you will now also have a similar lease liability schedule. Just like how we prepared a lease liability schedule originally, you will also now again have a revised lease liability schedule, but interest will no longer be calculated at 6%. Interest will now be calculated at 7%. All right. After modification at the beginning of year 6, you have a revised depreciation per annum and you have a revised lease liability schedule. The revised lease liability schedule will no longer have interest calculated at 6%, but it will have interest calculated at 7%, because you have actually now you have now discounted the future cash flows at 7%. Whatever is the discount rate that you're using for the purpose of discounting the cash flows, the same discount rate will actually be used for the purpose of computing interest. All right. For the sake of simplicity, although the question did not ask, for the sake of communication, I will actually prepare the lease liability schedule from year 6 to year 10. Let me prepare the lease liability schedule from year 6 to year 10. I have years. I have a opening balance. I will have interest, and like I mentioned, interest is going to be calculated at 7% this time. I then have payments. And remember, the payments are no longer going to be 1 lakh, they're going to be equal to 95,000, which is the revised payment schedule. All right, and then I have the closing balance. Now, at the beginning of year six, we have made this modification, and after the modification, I would be having a balance in the books of accounts of 3,89,519. I had a balance of 4,21,238 at the end of year 5. I had a balance of 4,21,238 at the end of year 5, but then I'm reversing out 31,719 of my liability. Therefore, the lease liability that I would have is 3,89,519. So it's going to be 389,519. Interest will be calculated as 3,89,519 multiplied by 7 percentage, which is going to be equal to 389,519 multiplied by 7 percentage. It's going to be 27,266. All right, I'm ignoring the decimals. It's going to be 27,266. I will have a payment at the end of year 6 of 95,000. So that brings my closing balance to 389,519 plus 27,266 less 95,000, which is equal to 3,21,785. I then have year 7. The beginning balance will be 3,21,785. Interest will be 321,785 multiplied by 7 percentage, which is equal to 22,525. I then have a lease payment of 95,000. So it will be 3,21,785 plus 22,525 less 95,000, which is equal to 2,49,310. For year 8, I have 2,49,310 as the beginning balance multiplied by 7 percentage is 17,452 less 95,000 of payment at the end of 8th year. That is going to give me a closing balance of 1,71,762. At the beginning of year 9, I have 1,71,762 multiplied by 7 percentage, which is going to be 12,023 as the interest, and less 95,000 of lease payment. That will give me a closing balance of 88,785. For year 10, I'm going to have a beginning balance of 88,785. I am going to calculate interest at the rate of 7 percentage, which is going to be 6,215 less 95,000 of payment. The closing balance should ideally become equal to zero. Let us see whether it's exactly going down to zero. Yes, it is exactly going down to zero. If there was any rounding difference, I would have adjusted it in the interest column. All right. So I have a lease liability wherein I start with 3,89,519 after the modification, and at the end of 10th year, when the lease contract is getting over, the lease liability goes down to zero. I am calculating interest at the rate of 7 percentage, which is the revised rate at which I have discounted the future cash flows. All right. So the lease liability schedule undergoes a change after modification because I now have to calculate interest at the revised discount rate. The depreciation also similarly undergoes a change. So I am actually going to have depreciation of 336,286 divided by 5, which is going to be equal to a depreciation of rupees 67,257 per annum. All right, the original depreciation that I calculated was actually equal to 73,601, but as a result of the modification, my future depreciation also undergoes a change. All right, so with that, we are actually done with illustration number 31. 36, I'm sorry. We're done with illustration number 36.